She was married off to a crippled Korean trillionaire everyone pitied, a man the world whispered was half dead, trapped in a wheelchair with dead eyes and a broken body. But on their wedding night, Julia discovered a secret so dangerous it could destroy global empires and turn her into the most powerful woman alive. Because the man she married wasn't crippled at all. He was the most lethal predator in the business world, and he'd been hunting in plain sight. This is the story of how a desperate woman became a queen, and how a king who'd forgotten how to trust learned to love the one person who saw past his lies. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to this channel, like this video, and comment below where you're watching from, because this story will shock you till the very end. The knock at her door came at 8 p.m., 3 sharp raps that sounded official. Julia's stomach dropped. She approached the door like it might explode, checked the peephole. A woman stood in the hallway, mid-40s, immaculate black suit, silver briefcase, expression that gave away nothing, not a process server. Julia had seen enough of those to know. This was something else. She opened the door. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, polite and calculated. "Julia Carter, my name is Margaret Song. I represent certain interests that would like to make you a proposal." Her accent was crisp, vaguely British, the kind that came from international schools and old money. "May I come in?" Julia's instinct screamed no, but desperation made people do stupid things, and she was past desperate. She was drowning. 5 minutes. Margaret stepped inside, glanced around the stripped apartment without judgment, and set her briefcase on the folding table. She didn't sit. "I'll be direct, Miss Carter. Your family's financial situation is dire. Bankruptcy won't save you from criminal fraud charges your father may face as a result of forged documents. Your sister will lose her scholarship. Your mother's mortgage will foreclose in 6 weeks." She recited it all like a grocery list, facts without feeling. "I know all that," Julia said, arms crossed, defensive. "Who are you really?" "I represent the Han family of Seoul, South Korea. Specifically, Han Junwoo." Margaret opened the briefcase, retrieved a folder, placed it on the table. "We're prepared to settle all your family's debts, fund your sister's education through graduation, and provide you with a monthly stipend of $50,000 for 1 year. In exchange, you'll enter into a contractual marriage with Mr. Han for a minimum period of 12 months. The words hit Julia like a slap. "Excuse me." "A marriage contract, legally binding, publicly visible, 1 year minimum, after which you may divorce with no penalties and a settlement of $5 million. Margaret's expression didn't change, like she offered women mail-order bride contracts every Tuesday. "All your family's problems disappear immediately upon signing." Julia laughed, sharp and bitter. "This is insane. Why me? I don't know any Han family. I've never even been to Korea." "Mr. Han requires a wife for personal reasons I'm not at liberty to discuss. You meet specific criteria: American, educated, no criminal record, no significant romantic entanglements, and most importantly, desperate enough to say yes." Margaret tilted her head. "You are desperate, aren't you, Miss Carter?" The honesty was brutal. Julia wanted to throw her out, tell her to take her briefcase and her blood money and disappear. But Kendra's face flashed in her mind. Her father, gray and weak in that hospital bed. Her mother, who hadn't slept in weeks. "Who is Han Junwoo?" Margaret pulled out a tablet, pulled up a photo. The man on the screen was maybe 32, Korean, sharp features that might have been handsome if they didn't look so severe. He sat in a wheelchair, expensive suit, hands resting limp on the armrests. His eyes stared past the camera, empty. Han Junwoo, CEO of Han Global Industries, net worth estimated at $47 billion. Industries include shipping, technology, pharmaceuticals, and defense contracting. She swiped to another image, a headline, "Tragic Heir, Han Junwoo's battle after devastating accident." 3 years ago, Mr. Han was involved in an incident that left him paralyzed from the waist down. He's been reclusive since. The marriage is intended to improve his public image and satisfy certain family obligations. Julia stared at the photo, the wheelchair, the dead eyes, the headlines that followed, Seoul's loneliest billionaire, the man who has everything but can't feel anything. She felt a flicker of pity, then pushed it down. So I'm supposed to marry a stranger, a disabled man I've never met, and pretend to be in love for a year? For money. For your family's survival. Yes. Margaret closed the tablet. You'll have separate living arrangements within his estate, minimal public appearances, no intimate obligations beyond what's required for photographs. It's a business transaction, Miss Carter, nothing more. And if I say no? Then I leave and you handle your problems alone. Margaret started packing up her briefcase. But we both know you can't. You have 48 hours before eviction. Your father's arraignment is in 2 weeks. Your sister drops out next semester. This offer expires when I walk out that door. Julia's hands clenched into fists. This was crazy. Marrying a man she'd never met, moving to another country, playing pretend for cameras. But the alternative was watching her family collapse, and she'd already failed them once by trusting Marcus. She couldn't fail again. How do I know this is real? Margaret pulled out a cashier's check, placed it on the table. $500,000. Good faith payment, clears tomorrow, the rest upon signing the contract and marriage license. She straightened. I need an answer now, Miss Carter. Julia picked up the check. It felt like a shackle and a lifeline at the same time. She thought about her mother's face when the hospital called about her father. Kendra's tears on the phone, the weight of every single failure that had brought her to this moment. When? The wedding. Margaret smiled. 3 weeks, Seoul. I'll send the contracts tomorrow. Julia looked at the photo of Han Junwoo one more time, that empty stare, that wheelchair, that fortress of loneliness. She wondered what kind of man needed to buy a wife. She wondered what kind of woman she was becoming by saying yes. Okay, I'll do it. Margaret nodded, snapped her briefcase shut, and walked to the door. She paused at the threshold, glanced back. One more thing, Miss Carter, don't expect love, don't expect friendship. This is a role, play it well and everyone wins. Catch feelings and you'll only get hurt. Then she was gone, heels clicking down the hallway, leaving Julia alone with a check that felt like 30 pieces of silver. Julia sat on her futon, stared at the check and cried, not from relief, from shame, because Margaret was right. She was desperate enough to sell herself, and the worst part was she'd do it again if it meant saving the people she loved. The media found out 2 weeks later. Someone leaked it, probably Margaret's people, because the coverage was immediate and savage. Headlines screamed, American woman marries crippled Korean billionaire, gold digger or saint. The comments were worse. Social media tore her apart. Opportunist, vulture, you couldn't get a man on your own, so you bought a cripple. She deleted her accounts after the 10th death threat, but the damage was done. Her friends stopped calling. Former classmates, she hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly had opinions about her life choices. Kendra was the only one who didn't judge. I don't care what they say, Jules, you're saving us. That makes you a hero, not a villain. Julia didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman drowning who'd grabbed onto a rock, only to realize the rock was an anchor. The contracts arrived. 73 pages of legalese that boiled down to, smile for the cameras, don't embarrass the family, and remember this isn't real. She signed on page 73, her name in black ink that felt permanent despite the expiration date. 3 weeks later, she was on a plane to Seoul, first class, champagne she didn't drink, and a future she couldn't imagine. She never met Han Junwoo, not even a phone call, just photos and contracts and Margaret's cold efficiency. She was flying blind into a marriage with a stranger, and the only thing she knew for certain was that nothing about this would end well. The plane touched down in Incheon at 6 a.m. Margaret met her at the private terminal, same black suit, same unreadable expression. Welcome to Seoul, Mrs. Han. The name felt foreign, wrong. Julia followed her to a black SUV with windows too dark to see through, climbed in, and watched the city blur past. Skyscrapers, neon, millions of people who didn't know or care that she'd just sold her life for theirs. The drive took 40 minutes, leaving the city behind for mountains and private roads that wound up into exclusivity. The estate appeared through the trees like something out of a nightmare disguised as a dream. High walls, security gates, cameras everywhere. The mansion itself was modern, all glass and steel and sharp angles, beautiful in a way that felt hostile. They pulled up to the entrance. Margaret turned to her. The wedding is tomorrow. Private ceremony, immediate family only, then a press conference. You'll meet Mr. Han tonight at dinner. Be polite, be quiet. Remember your role." Julia nodded, too exhausted to argue. She stepped out of the SUV and the mansion doors opened. A woman in a crisp uniform bowed, gestured for her to follow. The interior was as cold as the exterior. Marble floors, minimalist furniture, everything white and gray and expensive. No warmth, no personality, just money and distance. Her room was on the 3rd floor, enormous, a bed that could sleep 4, a view of mountains she didn't care about. She unpacked her single suitcase, clothes that suddenly felt cheap, and sat on the edge of the bed. Tomorrow she'd marry a man she'd never met. Tomorrow her life as Julia Carter would end, and Mrs. Han's performance would begin. She wondered if Han Junwoo was scared too. Then she remembered the check, the contracts, the cold transaction of it all, and decided he probably didn't feel anything at all. Dinner was at 8 p.m., formal, terrifying. A staff member came to her room an hour before, laid out a dress, simple black, elegant, expensive. Julia put it on, stared at herself in the mirror, barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like someone playing dress-up in a life that didn't belong to her. The staff member returned, led her through hallways that felt like a maze, down a grand staircase, toward double doors that opened into a dining room designed to intimidate. The table could seat 20, but only 3 places were set, far enough apart that conversation would require effort. Margaret sat at one end, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when Julia entered. "Sit. Mr. Han will join us shortly." Julia sat, spine straight, hands in her lap, every muscle tense. The silence stretched. 5 minutes. 10. She was about to ask if he was actually coming when she heard it. The soft whir of a wheelchair, her breath caught. The doors at the far end opened, and Han Junwoo entered, pushed by a male attendant in medical scrubs. Julia's first thought was that the photos hadn't done him justice, and her second thought was that justice might be the wrong word. He was beautiful in a dangerous way, sharp jawline, full lips set in a permanent line of displeasure, and eyes that were dark, cold, assessing. He looked at her the way someone might look at a piece of furniture they were considering purchasing. No warmth, no curiosity, just evaluation. The attendant positioned his wheelchair at the head of the table between them, adjusted his hands on the armrests, and stepped back into the shadows. Junwoo didn't speak. Margaret filled the silence. "Mr. Han, this is Julia Carter. Julia Han Junwoo, your fiancé." The word fiancé sounded absurd in context. Julia forced herself to meet his eyes. "It's nice to meet you." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. He stared at her for a long moment, expression unreadable, then shifted his gaze to Margaret. "She understands the terms." His English was perfect, accent subtle, voice low and controlled. The kind of voice that didn't need to rise to command a room. "She does," Margaret confirmed. "Good." He looked at Julia again, something flickering in his eyes she couldn't identify. "Tomorrow we marry. You'll smile for the cameras. You'll say the words they give you. You'll wear the ring and pretend this means something. Can you do that, Miss Carter?" The coldness in his tone made her want to flinch, but she held his gaze. "I signed the contract. I'll do my part." "Your part," he repeated, something almost like amusement touching his lips before disappearing. "Your part is to be seen and not heard unless spoken to. Your part is to make me look less pathetic to shareholders who think a man in a wheelchair can't run an empire. Your part is decoration, Miss Carter. I hope you're comfortable with that." Anger flared in her chest, hot and sudden. She'd expected coldness, maybe indifference, but not outright cruelty. "And your part is to be less of an asshole, but I guess we're both going to be disappointed." Margaret's eyes went wide. The attendant in the shadows tensed. The room went so quiet Julia could hear her own heartbeat. She just insulted a billionaire, her future husband, the man who held her family's fate in his paralyzed hands. Brilliant. Self-sabotage at its finest. But Junwoo didn't explode. Instead, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Interest, maybe, like she'd surprised him. "You have a spine. Unexpected." He leaned back in his wheelchair, studied her with new attention. "Most people who take my money learn to keep their mouths shut." Maybe I'm not most people, Julia shot back, adrenaline overriding common sense. Clearly, he gestured to the attendant. Dinner now. Staff appeared with plates, some kind of elaborate Korean cuisine Julia couldn't name, beautiful and untouchable. She picked at her food, appetite gone, hyper-aware of Junwoo's presence at the head of the table. He ate slowly, methodically, movements careful in a way that suggested either pain or practice. She noticed his hands, the way his fingers gripped the utensils with more strength than she'd expected from someone supposedly paralyzed. Noticed the way his shoulders held tension despite his stillness. Noticed that he never stopped watching her, even when he seemed focused on his plate. Why me? The question escaped before she could stop it. Margaret looked ready to intervene, but Junwoo raised a hand, silencing her. Why not you? That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. He set down his fork, attention fully on her now. You're American. The board likes that, thinks it makes us look global, progressive. You're educated but not connected, which means you won't bring political complications. You're desperate, which means you'll follow the rules. And you're black, which in their small minds makes you exotic enough to be interesting but not threatening enough to matter. He said it all without inflection, like he was reading a grocery list. I don't care about any of that. I care that you'll do what you're told, take your money, and disappear when this is over. That's why you. Each word was designed to wound, and they did. Julia set down her own fork, appetite completely destroyed. You must be really lonely, Mr. Han, to buy a wife and then treat her like an employee before you've even said I do. Something dark flashed in his eyes. Loneliness requires the capacity to want human connection. I lost that 3 years ago along with my legs. I don't believe that. I don't care what you believe, he gestured to his attendant. I'm done, show Miss Carter back to her room. The attendant moved forward, but Julia stood on her own, chair scraping against marble. For the record, I don't think you're pathetic because of the wheelchair. I think you're pathetic because you're cruel to someone who's never done anything to you except agree to help you. She didn't wait for his response, turned and walked toward the door, spine straight, refusing to let him see how much his words had cut. Julia. Her name and his voice stopped her at the threshold. She looked back. Junwoo was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, something between curiosity and warning. Tomorrow, play your part, because if you don't, your family loses everything. And I promise you I'm not cruel enough to hurt you. I'm cruel enough to hurt them. The threat landed exactly as intended. Julia left without another word, followed the attendant back to her room, closed the door, and finally let herself break. She cried into her pillow, silent and furious, hatting him, hatting herself, hatting every choice that had brought her here. She'd married men off for money before in her mind, judged women who did exactly what she was about to do. Now she understood. Desperation didn't care about pride. It just cared about survival. Her phone buzzed. A text from Kendra. Mom's mortgage payment cleared. Dad's lawyers are optimistic. You did this, Jules. Thank you. 3 heart emojis. Julia stared at the text until her vision blurred. This was why. This was the only thing that mattered. She could endure Han Junwoo's cruelty. She could endure a year of being decoration. She could endure anything if it meant her family was safe. She typed back, "Love you." Then she turned off her phone, pulled the covers over her head, and tried to forget that tomorrow she'd promise forever to a man who'd already made it clear forever meant nothing. The wedding day arrived with mechanical efficiency. Staff woke her at 6 a.m., led her to a suite where a team of stylists descended like locusts. Hair, makeup, nails. Every part of her transformed into someone camera-ready, someone who looked like she belonged in a billionaire's world. The dress was custom, white silk that fit perfectly despite her never being measured, elegant and understated in a way that screamed money. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. A beautiful stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. Margaret appeared at 9, surveyed her critically, nodded. You'll do. Remember, smile, follow the script, don't improvise. This is theater, not reality. I know what it is, Julia said quietly. The ceremony was at 11, held in a private room of the estate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens that probably cost more to maintain than her father's entire business. Immediate family only, Margaret had said, but Julia's family wasn't here. Too expensive to fly them over, and honestly, she didn't want them to see this. Didn't want Kendra watching her sell herself, even if it was for their benefit. Junwoo's family was different. His mother sat in the front row, elegant, cold, barely looked at Julia. His younger sister, maybe mid-20s, scrolled through her phone, bored. A handful of executives and board members filled the other seats, witnesses to a transaction masquerading as a union. A photographer circled like a shark, capturing every moment for the press release Margaret had already written. Julia walked down the aisle alone, no father to give her away, no music, just the sound of her heels on marble. Junwoo waited at the front in his wheelchair, wearing a black suit that probably cost more than her college tuition, expression as empty as it had been at dinner. She stopped beside him, and he didn't look at her. Not once. The officiant spoke in Korean first, then English. Words about unity and partnership that meant nothing in context. Julia barely heard them. She was too focused on not crying, not running, not screaming that this was insane and everyone here knew it. When the officiant asked if she took Han Junwoo to be her lawfully wedded husband, she said, "I do," and hated how steady her voice sounded. When he asked Junwoo the same, there was a pause, long enough that Julia's heart stopped. Long enough that she thought he might actually say no, call this whole thing off, and she didn't know if she'd be relieved or devastated. Then he said, "I do," in that controlled voice that gave away nothing, and it was done. "You may kiss the bride." Julia's stomach dropped. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't planned for it. The photographer moved closer, camera raised. Junwoo finally looked at her, something unreadable in his dark eyes, and for a moment she thought he'd refuse. Make a scene. Prove this was all a farce. Instead, he raised one hand slowly, cupped the back of her neck with surprising strength, and pulled her down. The kiss was brief, chaste, his lips barely touching hers. But in that split second of contact, Julia felt something she hadn't expected. Heat. Not warmth, but actual heat, a spark of something that made her breath catch. His fingers tightened slightly on her neck, possessive, and then he released her, turned his wheelchair away, and the moment was gone like it had never existed. The photographer got his shot. The witnesses applauded politely. Margaret checked her watch, satisfied. Julia stood there, hand unconsciously touching her lips, wondering if she'd imagined the electricity or if he'd felt it too. The press conference was immediate, no time to process. They were ushered into another room, a staged backdrop, microphones everywhere. Junwoo sat in his wheelchair at a table, and Julia was positioned beside him, close enough to look united, far enough to maintain the illusion of respect. Margaret stood off camera, nodding at her, and Julia remembered her lines. Questions came fast, mostly in Korean, translated by an assistant. "How did you meet?" "A mutual acquaintance introduced us." "Love at first sight?" "We connected on a deeper level." "How do you handle the challenges of Mr. Han's condition?" "We focus on what we can do, not what we can't." Every answer was scripted, rehearsed, lies delivered with a smile that hurt her face. One journalist, a woman with sharp eyes, asked in English, "Miss Carter, some people are saying you married Mr. Han for his money. What do you say to that?" The room went silent. Margaret's expression tightened. Junwoo didn't move, but Julia felt his attention shift to her, waiting to see if she'd break. She thought about the truth, about debt and desperation and choices that weren't really choices. Then she thought about Kendra's text, her mother's mortgage, her father's hope. She smiled wider. "I married Junwoo because he's an incredible man who deserves to be seen for more than his wheelchair." "If that makes me a gold digger, then I guess I'm the luckiest gold digger alive." A few journalists laughed. Junwoo's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to rest on hers on the table, a gesture that looked tender and felt like a brand. His skin was warm, rough with calluses she didn't understand. His fingers laced through hers, squeezed once, a warning or acknowledgement she couldn't tell. The cameras flashed, capturing their joined hands, the perfect image of a couple in love. Margaret called the conference to an end. Staff ushered out the journalists. Julia started to pull her hand away, but Junwoo held on, kept her there until the room emptied. Then he released her like she'd burned him. "You did well." "I lied well, you mean?" "Same thing in this world." He turned his wheelchair toward the door. "You have the rest of the day to settle in. Tomorrow, we'll establish routines. You'll have your space. I'll have mine. We'll see each other for appearances and nothing else. Understood. Perfectly. Julia watched him leave, that attendant pushing him through doors that closed with finality. Margaret approached, tablet in hand. Excellent work. The press is already running with the love story angle. Twitter's divided, but that's expected. We'll release more photos throughout the week, build the narrative. Great, Julia said flatly. Can I go now? Your room is ready. Dinner is at 8 again, but it's optional. Mr. Han doesn't expect you to join him unless necessary. Julia nodded, didn't trust herself to speak, and left. She found her way back to her room, locked the door, and collapsed on the bed still wearing her wedding dress. She was married. To a man who hated her existence. In a house that felt like a prison. For a year that might as well be a lifetime. She touched her lips again, remembered that brief kiss, the unexpected heat of it, and wondered what the hell she'd gotten herself into. Because that kiss, short as it was, had felt like the most honest thing in a day full of lies. And that terrified her more than anything else. Julia woke up the next morning in a bed that wasn't hers, in a house that felt like a mausoleum, married to a man who'd made it clear she was nothing more than a business expense. The ring on her finger caught the light, platinum and diamonds, beautiful and suffocating. She twisted it absently, wondering if she could get used to the weight of it, the symbolism of it, the lie of it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Han, a woman's voice, accented polite. May I come in? Julia sat up, pulled the covers around herself even though she was fully clothed in the pajamas she'd found laid out the night before. Yes. The door opened and a Korean woman in her 50s entered, carrying a tray. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile that felt out of place in this cold mansion. Good morning. I'm Mrs. Park. I manage the household staff. I've brought you breakfast. She set the tray on the bedside table, steam rising from tea and rice and dishes Julia couldn't name. Thank you, Julia said quietly. You didn't have to do that. It's my job, Mrs. Han, and please, if you need anything at all, just press the button by your bed. Someone will come immediately. Mrs. Park hesitated, then added more softly, I know this must be very difficult for you, but you're not alone here. Some of us remember what it's like to be far from home. The kindness was unexpected, and it made Julia's throat tight. I appreciate that. Mrs. Park bowed slightly and left, closing the door with care. Julia stared at the breakfast, appetite absent, but forced herself to eat anyway. She'd need her strength for whatever came next. The food was delicious, flavors she wasn't used to but could learn to love given time. Time. She had a year of it stretching ahead like a prison sentence. After breakfast, she showered, dressed in clothes from her suitcase that felt inadequate compared to the wedding dress, and decided to explore. The mansion was enormous, hallways branching in every direction, rooms she didn't have names for. She passed staff who bowed and hurried past closed doors that might have been offices or bedrooms or secrets. On the second floor, she found a library, floor-to-ceiling books in multiple languages, leather chairs that looked like they'd never been sat in, a fireplace that was purely decorative. She ran her fingers along the spines, found English titles mixed with Korean, Japanese, Chinese. Someone here read widely, or at least wanted to appear to. Mrs. Han. She turned. Margaret stood in the doorway, tablet in hand as always, expression neutral. I hope you slept well. Well enough, Julia lied. Good. I wanted to go over your schedule. You'll have Korean language lessons 3 times a week starting Monday. Cultural training twice a week. Public appearances will be scheduled with at least 48 hours notice. Mr. Han has requested you join him for dinner tonight and every Wednesday and Friday going forward for the sake of staff visibility. Aside from that, your time is your own within the estate. I'm a prisoner with a schedule. How thoughtful. Margaret's expression didn't change. You're free to leave the estate with security escort. You have access to a driver, credit cards with no limit, and anything you might need to make yourself comfortable. This isn't a prison, Mrs. Han. It's an arrangement. There's a difference. Is there? Julia crossed her arms. What does he do all day? Junwoo, I mean. Mr. Han runs a $47 billion empire. He has meetings, conference calls, decisions that affect millions of people. He doesn't have time for— Margaret stopped herself. For his fake wife, Julia finished. You can say it, I know what I am here. Margaret studied her for a long moment. You're more than you think, Mrs. Han, you just haven't figured that out yet. She turned to leave, paused. One more thing, the East Wing is off limits. Mr. Han's private quarters and offices. Don't go there without explicit permission. Noted. Julia waited until Margaret left, then decided she had no interest in testing boundaries on day 2. Whatever secrets the East Wing held could stay there. She had enough problems without adding snooping to the list. The rest of the day stretched endlessly. Julia tried reading in the library but couldn't focus. Tried watching television in her room, but everything was in Korean. Tried walking the grounds, but security followed at a discreet distance that made her feel like an asset being monitored rather than a person taking a walk. By 5 p.m., she was climbing the walls with boredom and isolation. Her phone buzzed. A text from Kendra, how's married life? Are you okay? Miss you. Julia stared at the message, fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could she say? That she'd married a man who looked at her like an expensive mistake. That she lived in a beautiful prison where even kindness felt transactional. That she'd never felt more alone in her life. She typed back, it's fine. Still adjusting. Love you. Then she turned off her phone before Kendra could ask follow-up questions Julia didn't want to answer. Dinner at 8 felt like a repeat of the night before, except this time Julia was determined not to let him win. She arrived exactly on time, wearing the same black dress because it was the only formal thing she owned that didn't feel ridiculous in this house. Junwoo was already at the table in his wheelchair, reviewing documents, barely acknowledged her entrance. She sat in her designated spot, and staff immediately appeared with food. They ate in silence for 10 minutes before she couldn't take it anymore. Do you always work through dinner? Yes, he didn't look up from his tablet. Must be exhausting. It's necessary. So is human conversation. That got his attention. He set down the tablet, looked at her with those dark, assessing eyes. You want to have human conversation with me, Julia? About what? The weather? Your feelings? How difficult this must be for you. I was thinking we could start with something simpler, like why you hate me. He blinked, clearly not expecting that. I don't hate you. You've been nothing but cruel since I got here. I've been honest, there's a difference. He picked up his wine glass, took a slow sip, and Julia noticed how carefully he held it, how his hand trembled slightly before he steadied it. The tremor was barely visible, but it was there. Evidence of the damage everyone said was permanent. You want me to pretend this is something it's not? Pretend we're friends, lovers, that this marriage means anything beyond the signatures on a contract? I want you to treat me like a human being instead of a problem you paid to solve. You are a problem I paid to solve. That's the entire arrangement. Julia set down her fork, suddenly not hungry. You know what I think? I think you're so used to people wanting something from you that you can't imagine someone just wanting to be treated with basic decency. I'm not asking for your heart, Junwoo. I'm asking for the bare minimum of respect. His jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he'd explode, send her away, prove every harsh assumption she had about him. Instead, he said quietly, You're right. She blinked. What? You're right, I've been an asshole, unnecessarily. He set down his wine glass, adjusted his hands on the wheelchair armrests with visible effort. I'm not good at this, at people, at trusting anyone enough to let them close. The last time I did, I ended up like this. He gestured vaguely at the wheelchair, expression bitter. So yes, I default to cruelty because it's safer than vulnerability, but you didn't ask for that. You asked for a year of playing a role, and I've made it harder than it needs to be. The apology, stilted and uncomfortable as it was, shocked her into silence. Julia stared at him, trying to reconcile this version with the cold stranger from before. Thank you for saying that. He nodded once, picked up his fork with that same careful grip, went back to eating like the conversation hadn't happened. But something had shifted. Some invisible wall had cracked just slightly. Julia picked up her own fork, allowed herself the smallest smile. Can I ask you something? She said after a moment. You're going to anyway. Why a year? Why not 6 months or 2 years? Why specifically 1 year? Junwoo was quiet for a long moment. Because in 1 year, certain business obligations will be satisfied. Contracts that require stability, board members who need convincing that I'm capable of leading long-term despite my condition. In 1 year, you'll have your money and your freedom, and we can both move on with our lives. So I'm your shield, until you don't need one anymore. Yes. At least he was honest. Julia appreciated that, even if the truth wasn't particularly flattering. And what happens to you after I leave? You go back to being alone in this fortress. I've always been alone, Julia. A wife leaving doesn't change that. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. He looked at her sharply. I don't need your pity. Good, because I'm not offering it. I'm just observing that you've built yourself a really beautiful prison and convinced yourself it's safety. She took a sip of water, met his eyes steadily. For what it's worth, I understand why, but understanding doesn't make it less lonely. And what would you know about loneliness? You have family, people who care about you. I have family I'm lying to every single day I'm here. People who think I married for love when really I married for money. You think that doesn't feel isolating? Julia shook her head. We're both alone, Junwoo. We're just alone in different ways. He stared at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't speak. Then, slowly, something in his expression softened. Not much, but enough that Julia saw the man underneath the armor for just a second. Maybe you're more perceptive than I gave you credit for. Is that your version of a compliment? It's the best you're going to get tonight. But there was the ghost of something in his voice that might have been humor. He adjusted his position in the wheelchair, and Julia noticed the wince he tried to hide, the way his shoulders tensed with pain he clearly lived with constantly. Does it hurt? The question was out before she could stop it. Your back, your legs, does it hurt all the time? His expression went carefully blank. That's a personal question. We're married. Isn't that the definition of personal? We're contractually obligated, not the same thing. But he didn't shut down the conversation entirely. After a long pause, he said, Yes, it hurts. Every day, some days worse than others. Pain management is part of my routine, along with physical therapy that does nothing except prevent atrophy. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. The doctors say I should be grateful I'm alive. That paralysis is a small price to pay for surviving an accident that should have killed me. But you don't feel grateful. Would you, if someone took your ability to walk, to run, to do half the things you used to take for granted? He shook his head. I learned to live with limitations, but grateful is the word I'd use. Julia felt something crack open in her chest. This wasn't the cold CEO or the cruel stranger. This was a man who'd lost something fundamental and hadn't figured out how to grieve it properly. I'm sorry that happened to you. Don't be. Pity is worse than cruelty. It's not pity, it's empathy. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in those dark eyes. You're going to be a problem, aren't you? What kind of problem? The kind that makes me forget why I built these walls in the first place. He said it quietly, almost to himself, then seemed to catch himself. Tell me something, Julia. If you weren't here, if you had your choice, what would you be doing with your life? The question surprised her. I don't know. Before everything fell apart, I wanted to open my own consulting firm, help small businesses avoid the mistakes my father made, be good at something that mattered. Why can't you do that now? Because I'm playing your wife in Korea. Kind of hard to start a business when I'm busy being arm candy. You have unlimited resources and nothing but time when you're not needed for appearances. Start it remotely. Build it while you're here. By the time you leave, you'll have something real instead of just a payout. He said it like it was obvious, like he couldn't understand why she hadn't thought of it herself. Julia stared at him. You're serious? I don't joke about business. You're smart, educated, wasting your potential feeling sorry for yourself. Stop it. Do something useful. He gestured to his tablet. I can introduce you to people who could help. Connections, advice. Consider it part of your compensation. Why would you do that? Because bored people make mistakes, and I need you focused on something other than how much you hate being here. But there was something else in his eyes when he said it, something that looked almost like he actually cared whether she succeeded. Julia felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. Okay, yes, I'd like that. Good, my office, tomorrow at 9. Bring ideas. He checked his watch, a movement that required him to lift his arm with visible effort. I have a conference call in 10 minutes. Enjoy the rest of your dinner. His attendant appeared from the shadows, moved behind the wheelchair. Julia watched as Junwoo was pushed away from the table, his hands resting limply on the armrests, the picture of a man who'd learned to accept help because he had no choice. The doors closed behind him, and she sat alone at that enormous table feeling like the world had just tilted sideways. He'd apologized. He'd offered to help her. He'd seen her as more than just decoration. It was more than she'd expected from this entire year, and they were only 2 days in. Julia touched her lips again, remembering that wedding kiss, the unexpected heat of it, and wondered if she was imagining the chemistry or if he felt it too. The next morning, Julia woke with purpose for the first time since arriving. She showered, dressed in something that felt more professional, and spent an hour before her meeting outlining business ideas on hotel stationery she'd found in the desk. By 8:45, she was packing her room, nervous energy making her restless. This was stupid. He probably didn't mean it. Probably said it to shut her up and wouldn't actually follow through. But at 8:55, there was a knock at her door. The same security guard from yesterday. Mrs. Han, Mr. Han is ready for you. Julia followed him through the maze of hallways to the east wing, to the office she'd never seen. The guard knocked once, opened the door, and gestured for her to enter. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with finality. Junwoo's office was exactly what she expected. Massive desk, floor-to-ceiling windows, everything expensive and intimidating. He sat behind his desk in his wheelchair, reviewing something on multiple monitors, and didn't look up when she entered. Julia stood there awkwardly, clutching her notes, wondering if she should speak or wait or leave. Sit. His voice was clipped, all business. She sat in one of the chairs across from his desk, and he finally looked at her. You brought ideas. Some. I don't know if they're any good. Let me decide that. He held out his hand, and she passed over her notes. He read in silence, expression giving away nothing, while Julia tried not to squirm. After what felt like an eternity, he set the papers down. This is solid, not revolutionary, but solid. The market analysis needs work. Your financial projections are optimistic to the point of fantasy, but the core concept is viable. So you think I could actually do this? With the right support, yes. Without it, you'd fail within 6 months. He pulled up something on one of his monitors, turned it so she could see. Names, companies, contact information. These are consultants I've used. Legal, financial, marketing. Tell them I sent you. They'll take you seriously. Julia stared at the screen, then at him. Why are you helping me? I told you, bored people make mistakes. That's not the real reason. He leaned back in his wheelchair, studied her with those intense dark eyes. Fine. You want the real reason? Because yesterday you looked at me and saw a person instead of a tragedy, and that's rare enough that I'm willing to invest in the person who did it. He said it matter-of-factly, like it didn't cost him anything to admit, but Julia saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he watched for her reaction. Thank you, she said quietly, for being honest. Don't thank me yet. I'm not doing this out of kindness. If you succeed, you'll be less of a burden. If you fail, at least you'll have been distracted. But the words didn't match the look in his eyes, and Julia was starting to understand that Junwoo said cruel things to protect himself from appearing vulnerable. I won't fail, she said with more confidence than she felt. Good, prove it. He turned back to his monitors. You can use the library as your office. I'll have it set up equipment for you. Anything you need, tell Mrs. Park. We're done here. Another dismissal. But this time Julia smiled as she left because she'd just been given something she hadn't had in months. Purpose. A future that didn't revolve around debt and desperation, and it had come from the last person she'd expected to offer it. She spent the rest of the day in the library making calls, sending emails, building something that felt like hers. The consultants Junwoo recommended responded immediately, respectful and helpful in a way that made it clear his name carried weight. By evening, she had meetings scheduled, a rough timeline, and the first stirrings of hope that maybe this year wouldn't be completely wasted. Dinner that night was different. Junwoo actually asked about her progress, listened when she explained her plans, offered suggestions that were sharp and useful. They talked about business for an hour, and Julia forgot to be nervous around him. Forgot that he was a billionaire and she was basically his employee. Forgot everything except how good it felt to be taken seriously by someone who knew what they were talking about. "You're smiling," he observed at one point. "Am I not allowed to smile?" "I didn't say that. It's just different. You've looked miserable since you arrived." "Maybe I'm less miserable now." She met his eyes. "Thank you for today, for giving me something to work toward." He shifted in his wheelchair, and again Julia noticed the small wince, the constant discomfort he lived with. "Don't thank me, just succeed. That's all the gratitude I need." But the way he looked at her when he said it suggested gratitude wasn't actually what he needed at all. He needed someone to see him as more than his wheelchair, more than his money, more than the cold facade he showed the world. And somehow, despite everything, Julia was starting to become that person. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to like this video and drop a comment telling us what you think of Julia and Junwoo's relationship so far. Are you rooting for them? Let us know. The days started to develop a rhythm. Korean lessons in the morning that frustrated her but felt productive. Afternoons in the library building her business with resources she could never have accessed on her own. Dinners with Junwoo on Wednesdays and Fridays where they talked about work, carefully avoiding anything too personal, maintaining the boundaries they'd established. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it wasn't hostility either. It was something in between, careful and fragile. Julia started noticing things about him. Small things. The way his jaw tightened when he was stressed. How his eyes tracked movement with an intensity that suggested constant vigilance. The moments when his hands would grip the wheelchair armrests so hard his knuckles went white, usually after hours in meetings that clearly exhausted him. He lived with pain she couldn't imagine, maintained control she knew had to be slipping sometimes, and never once asked for sympathy. 2 weeks into her stay, she saw him in the garden. She'd gone for a walk, needed air, and found him by the fountain in his wheelchair, staring at nothing. His attendant stood at a distance, giving him space, but close enough to help if needed. Julia almost turned back, didn't want to intrude, but something about the set of his shoulders made her stop. "Mind if I join you?" she called out. He didn't turn, but he didn't tell her to leave either. "It's your house too, technically." She sat on the bench near him, not too close, leaving space. They sat in silence for a while, listening to water and birds and the distant sounds of the city beyond the estate walls. Finally, Julia said, "Do you ever wish you could just leave? Get away from all of it?" Every day. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "But men like me don't get to leave. We carry our empires with us everywhere we go." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." He turned his wheelchair slightly to face her. "What about you? Do you ever regret saying yes, taking the deal?" Julia considered lying, but they'd established something like honesty between them. "Sometimes. Usually at night when I can't sleep and I'm wondering who I've become. But then I remember my sister in school, my father out of jail, my mother sleeping through the night for the first time in years, and I remember why I did it." Guilt is a powerful motivator. So is love. "Love," he repeated, like the word was foreign. "I'm not sure I remember what that feels like." "I don't believe that." "Why not?" "Because if you didn't feel anything, you wouldn't work this hard to protect what your family built. You wouldn't care about the legacy or the empire or any of it." Julia met his eyes. "You feel things, Junwoo. You're just really good at pretending you don't." He stared at her, something dangerous flickering in his expression. "You should stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Seeing through me. It's going to cause problems." But he didn't look away, and neither did she. The air between them felt charged, electric in a way that made Julia's pulse quicken. This was dangerous territory, forbidden territory. He was her employer, her temporary husband, a man she was supposed to keep at arm's length for exactly 1 year before disappearing with her payout. But sitting in that garden, watching the way the late afternoon light caught his sharp features, feeling the weight of his attention on her like a physical touch, Julia realized she was in trouble. Because the carefully maintained distance between them was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. Didn't know if she wanted to. "Julia," her name in his voice, low and rough, sent shivers down her spine. "Yes. We need to be careful." "Of what?" "Of this, whatever this is," he gestured between them. "I hired you to play a role. Catching feelings wasn't part of the contract." "Who says anyone's catching feelings?" But her voice came out breathless, betraying her. "I do, because I recognize the signs." He leaned forward slightly, as much as his wheelchair would allow. "I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. I feel the shift in the room when we're alone together. And I know I'm doing the same thing, which means we're both being stupid." "Maybe stupid isn't the worst thing we could be." "Yes, Julia, it is. Because when this year is over, you leave. That's the deal. That's what you signed up for. And if we blur those lines, if we pretend this could be something real, we're both going to get hurt." But even as he said it, his hand moved from his armrest, reached toward her, and Julia found herself leaning in despite every logical reason not to. His fingers touched her cheek, barely there, feather-light and burning all at once. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the electricity of that simple touch, the way her entire body responded to him like they were magnets pulled together by forces neither could control. "This is a mistake," he whispered. "Probably," she whispered back. They stayed frozen like that, his hand on her cheek, her eyes locked with his, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. And then his attendant cleared his throat from across the garden, shattering the moment. Junwoo pulled back like he'd been burned, hand returning to his armrest, expression closing off. "I should go. I have a meeting." He turned his wheelchair away from her, and she watched him leave, feeling like she just stood at the edge of a cliff and barely stopped herself from jumping. Julia sat alone in the garden for a long time after, fingers touching the spot on her cheek where his hand had been, trying to convince herself that keeping her distance was possible. But she was failing at it. Had been failing at it since that first dinner when he'd apologized. Maybe even since the wedding kiss that had felt more real than anything else in this arrangement. She was falling for her fake husband, for a man who'd bought her like a business asset, for someone she was supposed to leave in 10 months and never think about again. It was the stupidest, most dangerous thing she could possibly do. And she was going to do it. The incident in the garden changed things, not overtly, but in small ways that Julia felt like earthquakes beneath her skin. Junwoo became more distant again, canceled their Friday dinner, sent messages through Margaret instead of speaking to her directly. He was retreating, building those walls back up, and Julia understood why even as it frustrated her. They'd gotten too close, felt too much, and he was doing damage control the only way he knew how. But avoidance only worked when both people cooperated, and Julia was tired of pretending she didn't exist in his world beyond photographs and contracts. 3 days after the garden incident, she showed up at his office unannounced. The security guard tried to stop her, said Mr. Han was in meetings, couldn't be disturbed. She walked past him anyway, knocked once on the office door, and entered before anyone could physically remove her. Junwoo was on a video call, 3 faces on his monitors, all looking stern and corporate. He saw her enter, and something flashed in his eyes. Surprise, then irritation, then something else she couldn't identify. He said something in Korean to the people on screen, short and final, and ended the call without ceremony. "You can't just walk in here," he said, voice controlled but edged with steel. "And you can't just avoid me because you're scared." Julia closed the door behind her, leaned against it. "We need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about." "We have everything to talk about. You felt it too, in the garden. Don't pretend you didn't." His jaw tightened. "What I felt doesn't matter. What matters is the contract, the agreement. The fact that you're here temporarily and getting emotionally involved is a complication neither of us can afford." "Too late." Julia pushed off the door, moved closer to his desk. I'm already involved, and I think you are too, whether you want to admit it or not. Julia. No, let me finish. She planted her hands on his desk, leaned forward. I came here expecting to hate this, expecting to hate you, to count down the days until I could leave and never look back. But you're not what I expected. You're brilliant and broken and lonely, and you try so hard to pretend you don't need anyone that it actually hurts to watch. And maybe I'm stupid for caring about any of that, but I do. He stared at her, expression unreadable, but she saw the war happening behind his eyes. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying I see you, Junwoo, not the wheelchair, not the money. Not the CEO everyone's terrified of. I see the man underneath all of that, and She stopped herself, because saying the next words would cross a line there was no coming back from. You what? His voice was barely above a whisper. Julia straightened, suddenly aware of how exposed she'd made herself. I don't know yet, but I know it's more than I should feel, more than the contract allows. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them could say. Finally, Junwoo moved his wheelchair around his desk, positioned himself directly in front of her. Close enough that she could see the exact moment something shifted in his expression, from guarded to raw. You want honesty, he said quietly. Fine, I think about you constantly. Wonder what you're doing when you're not with me. Notice when you're not at dinner even though I pretend not to. I watch security footage of you in the library because I can't find an excuse to be in the same room without making it obvious. He laughed, bitter and sharp. I'm a $47 billion CEO acting like a teenager with a crush, and it's pathetic. Julia's breath caught. That's not pathetic. Yes, it is, because you deserve someone whole. Someone who can take you places without a wheelchair and a medical team. Someone who can. He stopped, frustration radiating off him. I'm not that person, Julia. I'm never going to be that person again. I don't care about any of that. You should. You should care that I can't even stand up without help. That I live with pain that makes me cruel sometimes. That my enemies would use you against me the second they realized you mattered. You should care enough to keep your distance and protect yourself. And if I don't want to be protected, then you're as foolish as I am. But his hand reached out, found hers, laced their fingers together. His palm was warm, rough with those calluses she'd noticed before. He held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath him. We can't do this, Julia. We can't let this become real. What if it already is? He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face the way he had in the garden. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and she saw him memorizing her features like he was afraid she'd disappear. Then we're both in trouble. Maybe I'm okay with trouble. She leaned into his touch, and his eyes darkened with want he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. Julia, her name was a warning and a prayer, if we cross this line. I know what happens. We complicate everything, break all the rules, probably destroy each other by the end. She covered his hand with hers, held it against her face. But I'm tired of pretending I don't feel this, aren't you? Every single day. His thumb brushed across her bottom lip, and she felt the touch everywhere. You're going to regret this. Probably, but I'll regret not trying even more. Something broke in his expression, some final resistance crumbling. He pulled her down, and she went willingly, awkwardly because of the wheelchair, but neither of them cared. His lips found hers, and this kiss was nothing like the wedding. This was heat and desperation and months of tension finally finding release. His hand fisted in her hair, angling her head, deepening the kiss until Julia forgot where she ended and he began. She gripped his shoulders, felt the strength in them, the tension he carried constantly. His other hand slid to her waist, pulled her closer, and she ended up half on his lap, the wheelchair creaking under their combined weight. It should have been awkward, should have reminded them both of all the reasons this was impossible. Instead, it felt inevitable, like they'd been moving toward this moment since the second she'd walked through his door. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Junwoo pressed his forehead against hers. This changes nothing. The contract still stands. You still leave in 10 months. I know. And if anyone finds out about this, it could be used against me, against us both. I know that too. Then you understand we have to be careful, discreet, that this stays between us. Julia pulled back enough to look at him. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I'm a selfish man who wants something he shouldn't have, and for once in my life I'm going to take it. His eyes were dark, intense, burning with a desire that made her shiver. But only if you're sure, only if you understand what you're risking. I'm sure. He searched her face, looking for doubt, for hesitation. Finding none, he kissed her again, softer this time but no less intense. When he pulled back, he adjusted her position on his lap, mindful of his limitations but refusing to let them stop him. My bedroom, tonight, after the staff changes shifts at 11. Julia's heart hammered. Okay. And Julia, his hand cupped her face again, gentle despite the heat in his eyes. Don't expect romance, don't expect promises, this is physical, a release, that's all it can be. She should be insulted, should recognize the emotional walls he was already rebuilding even as he invited her in. But she just nodded because she understood. He was protecting himself the only way he knew how. Physical, got it. Good, he released her, and she stood on shaky legs. Now get out before someone sees you leaving my office looking like that. Julia touched her lips, felt how swollen they were, how obvious it would be what they'd been doing. She straightened her clothes, tried to compose herself. At the door, she looked back. Junwoo had returned to his desk, was already pulling up documents like the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. But she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands weren't quite steady on the keyboard. Junwoo. He looked up, expression carefully neutral. For what it's worth, I think you're wrong. I think this could be more than physical if you'd let it. Then it's good I'm not letting it. But his eyes told a different story, one of want and fear and desperate hope he was too damaged to voice. Julia left before either of them could say something they couldn't take back. She practically floated back to her room, heart racing, body humming with anticipation and nerves. She was doing this, actually doing this, crossing every line they'd drawn, breaking every rule they'd established, and she didn't care. Because for the first time since arriving, she felt alive. The hours until 11 p.m. crawled by. Julia showered, changed into something comfortable, paced her room like a caged animal. She thought about texting Kendra, but what would she say? Having an affair with my fake husband who definitely has real feelings he refuses to acknowledge. She laughed at herself, at the absurdity of her situation, at how completely her life had derailed from anything she'd planned. At 10:55 p.m., she slipped out of her room. The mansion was quiet, most staff retired for the night, only security making rounds. She knew their patterns by now, knew the blind spots. She made it to the east wing without being seen, found the door Junwoo had described. It was unlocked. She slipped inside. His bedroom was massive, all dark colors and expensive furniture, windows overlooking the estate. Junwoo sat on the edge of his bed, no wheelchair in sight, and for a moment Julia was confused. Then she saw the effort it took him to maintain that position, the way his legs trembled slightly, the pain he was clearly pushing through to appear more capable than he was. You didn't have to, she started. Yes, I did. His voice was rough. I needed you to see me like this, not in the chair, not helpless, even if it's only for a little while. Her heart cracked open. She moved toward him, stopped when she was close enough to touch. You're not helpless, Junwoo. You never were. Tell that to my legs. But he reached for her, pulled her between his thighs, hands settling on her hips. Last chance to leave. Last chance to keep this professional. I don't want professional. Julia threaded her fingers through his hair, felt him lean into the touch. I want real, even if it's just for tonight. Then come here. She did. Let him pull her down, let him kiss her with a hunger that stole her breath. His hands were everywhere, learning her, claiming her, and she responded with equal desperation. They fell back onto the bed together, and he hissed in pain before covering it with another kiss. Stop, Julia said, pulling back. You're hurting yourself. I don't care. Well, I do. She shifted her weight, tried to find a position that wouldn't strain him. Tell me what works, what doesn't hurt. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse, too proud to admit limitations even here. Then he guided her, positioning them so his back was supported, his legs comfortable. And suddenly it wasn't about limitation at all. It was about trust, about him letting her see him vulnerable and choosing not to run. What happened next was slow, careful, intense in ways Julia hadn't expected. Every touch deliberate, every movement measured. Not because of lack of passion, but because they were learning each other, figuring out how to fit together despite obstacles neither had chosen. And when it was over, when they lay tangled in expensive sheets breathing hard, Julia realized she'd just made the worst and best decision of her life. Junwoo's arm was around her, holding her close, his face buried in her hair. She felt his heartbeat gradually slow, felt the moment he started to retreat emotionally even as he held her physically. "You should go, before morning." "I know. This doesn't change anything." "You keep saying that." Julia turned in his arms, met his eyes. "But I think it changes everything." "Julia, I'm not asking for promises. I know what this is, what it can't be." She touched his face, felt the stubble on his jaw. "But don't insult me by pretending it meant nothing, because it did, for both of us." He closed his eyes, jaw clenched. "Fine, it meant something happy." "Not particularly, because now it's going to hurt when I leave." "Then we stop, now, before it gets worse." "Can you do that? Stop." She waited, watched the war play out across his features. "Because I don't think I can." "We have to." "Why?" "Because you're scared of feeling something, of letting someone in." "Because feeling something for you is dangerous." His voice rose, raw and desperate. "Because the last time I trusted someone, the last time I let my guard down, I nearly died. Because everyone I've ever cared about either betrayed me or became a target. Because wanting you makes you vulnerable and I can't." He stopped, breathing hard, and Julia saw the terror underneath his anger. Not of her, of what she represented. Hope, connection. All the things he'd learned to live without, because having them meant risking devastating loss. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry someone hurt you so badly you can't imagine trusting anyone again. But I'm not them. And I'm not asking you to tear down all your walls. Just maybe let me stand on the other side occasionally." He opened his eyes, looked at her with such raw emotion it made her chest ache. "You're asking for something I don't know how to give." "Then learn, with me." She kissed him softly. "We have 10 months. Maybe we waste them being careful and distant and regretful. Or maybe we use them to figure out if this could be real. And when you leave, when the contract ends." "I don't know, but I'd rather have 10 months of something real than a year of nothing." Junwoo pulled her closer, buried his face in her hair again. "You're going to destroy me. Or you're going to destroy me. Either way, we're in this together now." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, neither willing to let go despite knowing they should. When Julia woke at 5 a.m., she slipped out quietly, made it back to her room without being seen. She climbed into her own bed, stared at the ceiling, and tried to convince herself she hadn't just made a catastrophic mistake. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "I already regret letting you leave. Jay." She smiled, typed back, "Good. Regret means you feel something." His response came immediately. "I feel too much. That's the problem." "Then maybe stop fighting it," she sent. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Meet me for breakfast, 7 a.m., library." Julia's heart soared. It wasn't a declaration of love, wasn't a promise of forever, but it was him choosing not to retreat completely, choosing to try despite every instinct telling him not to. "I'll be there." She fell back asleep with her phone clutched to her chest, and for the first time since arriving in Korea, she dreamed of something other than debt and obligation. She dreamed of dark eyes and calloused hands, and a man who was learning to trust again one painful step at a time. When 7 a.m. came, she found him in the library. Not in his wheelchair, but standing with the help of a cane she'd never seen before, leaning against a bookshelf. He looked exhausted, like standing cost him everything, but he was upright. For her, the gesture broke something in her chest. "You didn't have to stand," she said softly. "I wanted to." His free hand reached for her, pulled her close. I've spent 3 years hiding behind that wheelchair, using it as armor, but with you, I don't want to hide. Junwoo. Let me finish. He touched her face, traced her features like he had the night before. I can't promise you forever. I can't even promise you next month, but I can promise you honesty. And honestly, Julia, you terrify me, because you make me want things I gave up on years ago. Normal things, simple things, like having breakfast with someone I care about without calculating the risk. Then let's just have breakfast. No calculations, no risk assessment, just two people eating together. He smiled, small and genuine, and Julia realized it was the first real smile she'd seen from him. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is. She took his hand, the one not holding the cane, laced their fingers together. Maybe we've been making it complicated because we're both scared. I'm definitely scared. But he didn't let go of her hand, didn't retreat behind his walls. Instead, he let her help him to the table Mrs. Park had set up, let her see him struggle with his cane, let her witness the effort it took him to lower himself into a chair. And when they finally sat across from each other eating Korean breakfast food and American coffee she'd requested, it felt like the most honest moment Julia had experienced since arriving. They talked about nothing important, her business plans, his upcoming meeting with shareholders, the weather, but underneath the mundane conversation was a current of something deeper, understanding, connection, the fragile beginning of something that could either save them or destroy them both. When breakfast ended and Junwoo's attendant arrived to help him back to his wheelchair, Julia watched him transform. The vulnerability disappeared. The walls went back up. The cold CEO returned like flipping a switch. But before the attendant wheeled him away, he looked back at her, and in that glance was everything he couldn't say out loud. I see you, his eyes said. I'm trying, don't give up on me yet. Julia nodded, understanding perfectly. They were both treading dangerous ground, both risking everything for something that might not even survive the year. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like the risk might actually be worth it. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what you think is going to happen next. Are Julia and Junwoo headed for happiness or heartbreak? Drop your predictions below. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of Julia's life. By day, she and Junwoo maintained their careful distance. He in his wheelchair, cold and professional at public events and board meetings she occasionally attended. She playing the devoted wife for cameras, smiling on cue, saying all the right things. But at night, when the mansion went quiet and the staff retired, they found each other. In his room. In the library. Once, daringly. In the garden under stars that felt like witnesses to something neither of them could name. They didn't talk about feelings, didn't discuss what would happen when the contract ended. Those topics were landmines they both avoided. Instead, they talked about everything else. Her business, which was actually taking off with clients and revenue that felt real. His company, the endless power plays and betrayals he navigated daily. Her childhood in Chicago. His childhood in Seoul under the weight of family expectations. They learned each other in pieces, stolen moments that felt more intimate than anything physical. But Julia noticed other things too, things that didn't make sense. The way Junwoo's hands were always calloused, rough like someone who worked physically despite his supposed paralysis. How his legs seemed stronger each time she saw him without the wheelchair, like he was training for something. The intense security that went beyond normal precautions, guards who moved like military operatives rather than corporate protection. The medical staff who weren't actually medical staff at all, but something else entirely. She didn't ask about it, partly because she was afraid of the answers, partly because some instinct told her the less she knew, the safer she was. But the questions lingered, growing louder with each passing day. On a Tuesday night in her 4th week at the mansion, everything changed. Julia woke to sounds that didn't belong, not the usual creaks of an old building or the distant hum of security patrols. These were purposeful, stealthy, wrong. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and reached for her phone. 2:47 a.m. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in eerie red. Then she heard it, Gunfire, distant but unmistakable, screaming, more shots, close now, too close. Julia's training kicked in, survival instincts she didn't know she had. She rolled out of bed, grabbed her phone, tried the door, locked from the outside. Panic clawed at her throat. She was trapped. More gunfire, closer, right outside her hallway. She heard shouting in Korean, commands barked with military precision. These weren't robbers. This was coordinated, professional. An assault. She backed away from the door, looked around desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. Found nothing except decorative items that would be useless against guns. The door exploded inward, lock shattered by a kick that sent splinters flying. A man in black tactical gear entered, gun raised, face covered by a mask. Julia screamed, stumbled backward, hit the wall. He advanced slowly, methodically, like he had all the time in the world. Said something in Korean she didn't understand. Raised the gun, aimed at her chest. This was it. She was going to die in a foreign country because she'd agreed to marry a stranger for money. This was how her story ended. The man's finger moved to the trigger. Then the window exploded. Glass everywhere. A figure crashed through, moving so fast Julia's brain couldn't process it. The tactical gear. The fluid, lethal movements. The way he grabbed the gunman's wrist, twisted until bones cracked, disarmed him in 2 seconds flat and drove an elbow into his throat that dropped him instantly. The figure turned. Julia's breath stopped. Because standing in her room, surrounded by broken glass and emergency lighting, breathing hard but steady, was Junwoo. But not the Junwoo she knew. This version stood tall, no wheelchair, no cane, no weakness. He moved like a predator, like someone trained to kill, and his eyes, when they met hers, were fierce and terrifying and protective all at once. "Are you hurt?" His voice was clipped, controlled, all business. Julia couldn't speak, could only stare. He was standing, walking, fighting. Everything was a lie. "Julia," sharper now, "are you injured?" She shook her head, still unable to find words. More gunfire echoed from downstairs. Junwoo cursed in Korean, moved to the unconscious man, pulled weapons from his tactical vest with practiced efficiency. He checked the magazine, chambered a round, moved like he'd done this 1,000 times. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, eyes on the door, body positioned between her and any threat. "There are approximately 12 hostiles in the mansion. My security is handling most of them, but some got through. I need you to stay behind me, stay quiet, and do exactly what I say. Understand?" "You can walk." The words finally came, stunned and accusing. "Not the time, Julia. You've been lying about everything. You're not paralyzed, you never were." Betrayal cut through shock, sharp and devastating. He looked at her then, and she saw guilt flash across his features before it was buried under urgency. "I'll explain everything. But right now, I need to keep you alive. Can you trust me long enough for that?" She wanted to say no, wanted to scream at him for the deception, for making her believe he was broken when he was clearly the most dangerous person in this building. But more gunfire erupted, closer now, and survival overrode anger. "Fine, but you better have a damn good explanation." "I do, let's go." He grabbed her wrist, pulled her toward the door, moved through the hallway with lethal grace. They passed bodies. Julia tried not to look, tried not to process that people had died tonight because of whatever game Junwoo was playing. He navigated the mansion like a completely different person. No hesitation, no weakness, just calculated violence when they encountered another hostile. The fight was brutal and efficient. The man raised his gun. Junwoo was faster. Disarmed him, used his own momentum against him, ended the threat in seconds. Julia watched with horrified fascination. This was the real Han Junwoo, not the cold CEO in a wheelchair, but a weapon disguised as a disabled man. They made it to his office in the East Wing. He slammed the door, locked it with multiple mechanisms, pushed her toward a bookshelf. "There's a safe room behind here. You'll be secure until this is over." "I'm not hiding while you." "You are, because if anything happens to you, He stopped, jaw clenched, fighting emotions he clearly didn't want to show. "Please, Julia, I need to know you're safe." The bookshelf swung open, revealing a reinforced steel door. A safe room, military grade, How many other secrets did this mansion hold? Julia stepped inside, turned back to face him. Don't you dare die out there. Not planning on it. He touched her face, quick and desperate. When this is over, I'll tell you everything. I promise. You better. She grabbed his tactical vest, pulled him down, kissed him hard. Because I'm not done being angry at you yet. He smiled, brief and genuine despite the chaos. I'd expect nothing less. Then he closed the door, and she heard locks engaging. She was alone in a sealed room with monitors showing security footage of the mansion. She watched him leave, watched him move through hallways taking down hostiles with precision that spoke of extensive training. Whatever he was, whoever he really was, he'd been hiding it behind a wheelchair for years. The assault lasted 20 minutes. Julia watched it all on monitors, unable to look away. Watched Junwoo coordinate with his security team through an earpiece she hadn't known he wore. Watched him fight with skills that looked military, maybe special forces. Watched him command like someone who'd done this before many times. When the last hostile was neutralized, when the mansion went quiet except for sirens in the distance, she saw him lean against a wall, saw the exhaustion hit him all at once. The door locks disengaged. Margaret appeared on the monitor, said something to Junwoo Julia couldn't hear. He nodded, straightened, walked toward the safe room. When the door opened and she saw him standing there, alive and whole and looking at her with such raw emotion it made her chest ache, Julia didn't know whether to hit him or kiss him. She settled for both, shoved his chest hard enough to make him stumble. You lied to me about everything. I know. You made me think you were broken, helpless, made me pity you. I never wanted your pity, that's why I told you the truth eventually. He caught her wrists when she tried to shove him again. Julia, please, let me explain. Explain what? That you're not actually disabled. That you've been playing some sick game with everyone while pretending to be in a wheelchair. That everything between us was just part of the act. No, that's not. He pulled her closer, and she let him even though she was furious. 3 years ago, someone tried to kill me. The accident was real. The injuries were real. I spent months learning to walk again, and yes, I can walk now, but it costs me. Pain I manage with medication. Weakness I hide with training. I'm not the man I was before, Julia. I just learned to compensate. So why the wheelchair? Why keep pretending? Because the people who tried to kill me are still out there. Board members, competitors. Enemies who want control of my company. If they knew I'd recovered, knew I was strong again, they'd attack differently, more directly. But a man in a wheelchair, he laughed bitterly. A man in a wheelchair is dismissed, underestimated. They think I'm weak, so they make mistakes, get sloppy. I've spent 3 years using their assumptions to dismantle their power piece by piece. Julia stared at him, processing. Tonight, the attack, that was them. A final desperate attempt by the last board members I haven't removed yet. They hired professionals to eliminate me, make it look like a robbery. But I've been preparing for this. Tonight was their last chance, and they failed. He cupped her face, thumbs brushing her cheekbones. I'm sorry you got caught in it. Sorry you had to see that side of me, but I would have torn this entire mansion apart to keep you safe. You should have told me, should have trusted me with the truth. I wanted to. Every day I wanted to, but the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone was. And then you became important to me, and I couldn't risk. His voice cracked. I couldn't risk them using you against me. Too late, they already tried. She touched the tactical vest he still wore. Felt the solid reality of him. You're really okay, not hurt. I'm fine, trained for this. He pulled her closer, wrapped his arms around her like she was the only thing keeping him upright. I thought I was going to lose you tonight, when I heard they'd breached your floor, when I couldn't get to you fast enough. But you did, you saved me. Julia buried her face in his chest, let herself shake now that it was over. You stood up, walked, fought for me. For you, always for you. He kissed the top of her head. I know you're angry. No, I should have been honest from the beginning. But Julia, everything between us, that was real. The only real thing in 3 years of lies. She pulled back to look at him. Everything. Everything, the way I feel about you. The way you make me want to be better than I am. The way I'm terrified of losing you when this contract ends. He searched her face. I love you. I didn't mean to, didn't want to, but I do. Julia's breath caught. You love me. Yes, and I know it's selfish. No, I have no right to ask you to stay beyond our agreement, but I'm asking anyway. Not as your employer, not as the man who bought a year of your life, but as the man who wants every year after that if you'll give them to me. Tears blurred her vision. You're asking me to stay, to really stay. I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me again, for real this time. No contracts, no expiration date, just you and me figuring out how to build something permanent. His hands were shaking where they held her face. I know I don't deserve you. No, I've lied and manipulated and done terrible things to survive. But you make me want to be someone worthy of your trust, and if you'll give me a chance to earn that, I'll spend the rest of my life trying. You're an idiot, Julia said through tears. A brilliant, dangerous, emotionally stunted idiot. Is that a yes? It's a maybe. Ask me again when you're not covered in tactical gear and adrenaline. But she kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. For what it's worth, I love you too, even though you're exhausting. He laughed, the sound surprised and delighted. I'll take it. Good, because you're stuck with me now, contract or no contract. She rested her forehead against his. But we're having a long conversation about honesty and trust and all the things we need to fix. Deal, I'll tell you everything, show you everything, no more secrets. He kissed her again, deeper this time, starting with the fact that I've been planning to ask you to stay since about week 2. Week 2, you hit it well. I'm good at hiding things, but I'm tired of hiding how I feel about you. He held her close, and Julia felt something settle in her chest. Something that felt like home despite the chaos and danger and absolute insanity of her situation. She'd come to Korea to save her family, married a stranger for money, expected to hate every minute of a year-long contract. Instead, she'd fallen in love with a man who was both more and less than he appeared. A man who'd learned to weaponize weakness, who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten how to feel, until somehow she'd found a way through. 3 months later, they remarried. A real wedding this time, small and intimate, just family and the few people they actually trusted. Junwoo walked down the aisle, no wheelchair, no pretense, and when he said, I do, it was with his whole heart. Julia's family flew in, and her mother cried through the entire ceremony. Kendra gave a toast about how Julia had always been the strongest person she knew, and now she'd found someone equally strong to stand beside her. The board members who'd ordered the attack were arrested. Assets seized. The company restructured under Junwoo's complete control. He still used the wheelchair occasionally for certain meetings, but the secret was out. The world knew he'd recovered, and the media had a field day. But public opinion shifted when they saw Julia beside him, not as decoration but as partner. She'd launched her consulting firm successfully, was building something real that had nothing to do with his money or influence. They were a power couple in the truest sense, not because of wealth or status, but because they'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. They fought through lies and contracts and assassination attempts to find something genuine. And on the nights when Junwoo's pain was bad, when the damage from his accident reminded them both that he'd never be fully healed, Julia was there. Not pitying him, not treating him as broken, just loving him exactly as he was. 6 months after their real wedding, Julia stood on the balcony of their bedroom overlooking Seoul, and Junwoo came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. Regret it yet? Which part, marrying you the first time or the second? Either, both, any of it. She turned in his arms, looked up at the man who'd been so many different people before finally letting her see who he really was. Not even a little bit. You. Not a single second. He kissed her, soft and sure. Though I do regret not telling you the truth sooner, would have saved us both a lot of drama. But then we wouldn't have this story to tell, and it's a pretty good story. It's an insane story. The best ones usually are, Julia smiled. Besides, you promised me no more secrets, so I'm choosing to believe you. No more secrets, he agreed, except the good kind, like the fact that I'm planning something for our anniversary. That's not a secret, that's a surprise, there's a difference. Is there? He laughed, the sound free and genuine. Either way, you're stuck with me, Mrs. Han, for better or worse. I seem to remember saying those words twice, so yes, I'm very stuck. She kissed him again. Lucky me. They stood on that balcony as the sun set over Seoul, two people who'd started as strangers bound by contract and became partners bound by choice. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Junwoo still had enemies. Julia still struggled with trust after so many lies. They both carried scars, visible and invisible. But they'd learned something important. Love wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing someone's chaos along with their calm, their weaknesses along with their strengths, their truth along with their lies, and deciding all of it was worth fighting for. Julia had come to Korea expecting to sacrifice a year of her life. Instead, she'd found the rest of it. And Junwoo, who'd spent 3 years hiding behind a wheelchair and armor made of ice, had finally learned that the strongest thing he could do was let someone in. They went inside together, and Julia closed the balcony doors behind them, sealing out the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, they were just two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and decided to build something permanent in a world of temporary things. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment Power Couple if you loved Julia and Junwoo's journey. Drop your thoughts below, would you have stayed or left? And check out our other stories for more romance, drama, and unexpected twists. Until next time.